Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. This is the 9th of 9 episodes featuring the work of the 2019 Sacred Writes Public Scholarship Cohort. Sacred Writes provides support, resources, and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend checking out their fantastic work on Twitter at sacred_rights or online at sacred-rights.org. Over this series of 9 episodes, I have felt so lucky to collaborate with Dr. Elizabeth Bucar and Dr. Megan Goodwin at Sacred Writes, as well as the 9 amazing scholars I've spoken to and from whom I have learned so much. I have to send out a heartfelt thank you to my guests in this 9-episode miniseries for your collaboration, your collegiality, your promotion, and your dedication to spreading research and scholarship to all audiences. So this episode features the work of Dr. Alison Melnick Dyer. Dr. Melnick Dyer is Assistant Professor of Asian Religions at Bates College. In this episode, we discuss her career as a scholar and expert on gender and Tibetan Buddhism. We discuss her scholarship and writing focused on the life of Mingyur Peldrön as well, an 18th century Buddhist nun and religious leader. Dr. Melnick Dyer is currently working on a book manuscript featuring her research about Mingyur Peldrön, so keep your eyes peeled for that in the future. You can follow Dr. Alison Melnick Dyer on Twitter at Alison Melnick, that's at ALISONMELNICK. As always, you can follow me on Twitter at classical_ideas. Without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Alison Melnick Dyer. Dr. Alison Melnick Dyer, thank you so much for coming on Classical Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you here. Can you spend a moment and introduce yourself to the audience, however you see fit?
Sure. So I am an assistant professor of Asian religions at Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. And my area of specialty is looking at the intersection of gender and privilege in Buddhist history.
Fantastic. That's such a topic I've never had on the show before. This is going to be great. Can you describe a little bit of your academic path to becoming interested in Buddhism and Buddhist history in general? Like, what were some of your crucial stepping stones and turning points along your academic journey?
Sure. Yeah. So I would say the first stepping stone was when I discovered that studying Buddhism from an academic perspective was a thing. I had not been aware of that. I'd been a practitioner for most of my young life, and in high school, I went to a public high school in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we could take classes at the University of Michigan. So I was working at a bookstore at the time called Shaman Drum, and one of my coworkers was telling me about this awesome class that he was a grad student instructor for. And basically, I became intrigued by this and decided that I was going to try and take a class as a high school student. And I thought it was awesome, and then sort of forgot about it for a few years, and a couple of years later in college realized that I could take more similar classes and got really into Buddhist studies as an academic pursuit. It was not something that I had expected to do. It was more something that I felt passionate about, and slowly inched my way from a political science major into an Asian studies major.
And you came at that from a Buddhist practitioner perspective at first?
I did, yeah, at first, and then became really interested in the ways that religious institutions function and the ways particularly that Buddhist institutions function, and realized that in order to explore that more, I needed to be approaching it from the academic perspective. So eventually decided to go to graduate school, and at that point shifted over to a religious studies um, approach.
Interesting. How did you do you remember how you found Buddhism in the first place in order to become interested enough to actually practice it?
Yeah, so I found Buddhism in the first place through an aunt and uncle who were interested in it, who taught me very um, uh, basic calm abiding meditation when I was a real little kid, as a
Mm.
way for me to help calm myself down. And when I was in high school, I think my first year in high school, I uh, decided that I wanted to start attending the Zen Buddhist temple in Ann Arbor, and announced this to my mother, and she said, "Okay, great, sure, you can do that." And I went and said, "Well, I don't have any money, but I want to take a meditation class." And the priest there very compassionately said, "Sure, you can work in exchange for taking the class."
Mm.
And of course, that work turned into more practice.
So you are a 2019 fellow for the Sacred Rites Public Scholarship in Religion organization, which I absolutely love because as a podcaster, I care a ton about public scholarship and making the work of experts accessible to the wider world. Like I find so many academic books that ideas just get locked into, and the greater world who might be curious about those doesn't know that they're in these books. So that's what I love doing about this show, is finding the works that I feel like get locked inside of these inaccessible places for most people, and then putting them out into the world and seeing who grabs onto them and how they get interested in them. How and why did you become interested in pursuing this particular opportunity in public scholarship with sacred rites?
It's funny. I actually became interested in it for a lot of the same reasons that you're talking about. I feel like there's this trove of academic knowledge that exists that is not necessarily accessible to a wider public audience, and could be of really great interest and also of benefit for a larger audience to be thinking about these things and discussing these things. So for me, it's about bridging this gap between this brilliant scholarship on one side and a wider audience who may very well want to be discussing and thinking about these cool ideas. um,
How,
yeah.
how did you find sacred rites in the first place?
So I found Sacred Rites through my colleague Megan Goodwin,
Mm.
and we had had many conversations about this gap and how to bridge it over the years. And so when she hatched the Sacred Rites concept with Liz Buchar, I said, "Oh, this is amazing! How can I be how can I participate?" And when they announced the 2019 cohort, I applied.
That's so cool. Have you listened to Keeping It 101 with Megan Goodwin and Elise
Yeah,
Morgenstein first? It's amazing. I love them
it's
so
amazing.
much. That show is so cool.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. Everyone should listen to that show. Keeping it.
absolutely. Keeping It 101. So I had Alex Gardner on this show, and he founded a group called Treasury of Lives. And I know that you know who they are because you've written for them. So Alex is a Tibet scholar, he's a biographer, and we had a really cool chat about his most recent book. And he spoke about the ways that he fell in love with Tibet. And I know that you're interested in this as well. And it was so wonderful to hear from Alex his story of how he came to care so much about Tibet. And in your writing, you write about Tibet as well. How did you come to fall in love with Tibet as a topic you wanted to explore within your own work?
That's a great question, and it actually features Alex gardener. My answer does. So when I was in college, I had the opportunity to go on a study abroad trip to Tibet, and that trip was led by Andy Quintman and Gareth Sparham. And we were there for 2 months. It was amazing, mind-blowing experience to be, first of all, in a place that was so different from my home in Michigan. And at the same time, I found that I was able to make connections with the people there. And it was very much like I like the sort of metaphor of falling in love, because it was like falling in love with this landscape, with this community of people, Tibetan people, and learning about their form of Buddhism, which was still very new to me, and but still having these sort of rose-colored glasses on about what Tibetan culture and society were all about. And the following year, I had the opportunity to go a second time on this study abroad trip, and at that time it was being led by Andy Quintman and Betsy Napper and Alex Gardner. And during that trip, I was able to build on what I had learned from my initial encounter with this community and actually spend more time with Tibetans, specifically with Tibetan nuns, and learn more about the reality of their lives. And through that process, I realized this is what I want to be doing with my life, is learning about and talking about what Tibetan nuns are doing and why. And so at that point, I developed a more realistic perspective. Those rosy glasses went away, but but the relationship deepened, and I actually came to recognize some of the things that make studying religion and culture really beautiful, which is looking at the reality of the thing rather than the fantasy.
So most listeners will never have the opportunity to go to Tibet, most likely. And I wonder if you can go on a sensory journey with me for a second. And if you can think back on those trips, that when you were in Tibet, having all these, fantastic experiences, what are some of the sensory experiences that stand out to you the most? Like, are there any sights or smells or feels that you can describe from your memory of being in Tibet that a lot of people will never get to experience?
Absolutely, yeah. So the mountains are the first thing that come to mind. So the Himalayan plateau is this amazing geography, and so if you can imagine being on the side of a very tall, somewhat really rocky, kind of high desert mountain, looking out across a valley and seeing mountains on the other side. And having it be so clear and so sunny and bright that you can see a rainstorm coming, like a small bank of clouds with the rain. You can see it coming towards you and passing by. It was a really beautiful place to be, and I hate humidity, so being in the high dry desert was wonderful, but also being in a place where you can see the landscape in high relief.
I love that. That's wonderful. So I've been reading some of your work the last several days, specifically a piece called Female Authority and Privileged Lives. Now, you have a biography sort of a figure that you write a lot about. And I am actually at a loss as to how to pronounce the name
Yeah.
properly. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if you can explain who this person is that you care so deeply about, explain how to pronounce it as well.
Sure. Yeah. Her name is Mingyur Peldrön, or in depending on where you are, Mingyur Peldrön. But she uh, is a Tibetan Buddhist nun who lived in the 18th century, and she's a fascinating figure. She was born into a powerful religious family. She was born and raised at a place called Mindroling Monastery, which was a religious institution that her dad and her uncle had founded. And she had a really unusual life in insofar as she had this amazing religious training in her youth. She had this upbringing where her father and her uncle directed her studies from a young age, and she was able to use that education in her adult life in order to to cultivate religious authority. So she's born into a life of really high privilege, and but was unusual in that her family let her become a nun, and she was able to sort of leverage her privilege to cultivate this religious authority in the context of being a monastic woman, which is very unusual. There are a handful of women for whom we have stories like this. And so she lived through a civil war. She went into exile for several years. Most of her family was killed. Mindra was destroyed. And she was able to then return after the Civil War and help rebuild, and became a prominent leader in her community. So I'm writing a book about her life, and also about her hagiography,
Mm.
which is a really fascinating document.
Okay, so you mentioned the hagiography, and it's written by one of her disciples. So for those who don't know this term, hagiography, I've never actually said that word on this show ever. What is a hagiography, and how did you come to find this particular text about Mingyur Peldron?
Yeah. So first of all, so the term hagiography actually comes out of scholarship on medieval European saints. So it's a term that, in Mingyur Peldron's case, does apply. I'm using it to talk about a text that in the Tibetan genre is called a namtar. So, in the medieval European context, hagiography is a life story of the saint that is meant to show their soteriological successes. How did the person become a saint? How do we know they were a saint? What miraculous accounts do we have of that person? Um, and hagiography applies to a wide range of
Hmm.
different genres. So in the case of Mingyur Peldron, she has a namtar written about her. And a namtar it's a form of life writing. So it was written by her disciple. He was a monk. He was about 15 years younger than she was. He wrote it after her death. And namtar also refers to a range of Tibetan life writing that may or may not look more like biography. It might look more like hagiography. In Mingyur Peldron's context, it really looks like hagiography. He's highlighting her experiences of enlightenment, her religious accomplishments, and he's supporting those with references to miraculous occurrences, signs and portents, and all of that kind of stuff.
Interesting. Well, you write in your piece, Female Authority and Privileged Lives, about this source, this hagiography being the primary source for a lot of your work. And I love the talking to historians and scholars about what it is that they do as far as like researching archival documents and examining historical pieces and primary sources. Can you talk about your experience as a scholar of examining this work and what it is that you do in order to study something like this?
Sure, yeah. So I first learned that this work existed when I was in grad school, and I was learning about Mingyur. I was interested in it, and my grad advisor, Curtis Schaefer, told me that this text existed, that there was this life of this woman. She had been an important teacher, and no one had written about her. So I would, well, yeah. So I basically I became really intrigued by her story and started reading it, and realized that the text was functioning at multiple levels, and I wanted to explore those more, because I think they're interesting in terms of how they talk about her life, her actual lived life, but also how the text talks about things like her gender, and her family, and her view of the religious institution at the time. So I got into it. I started reading it, and for a long time I only had one version of it, and there really is only one version of this Namtar. There are a couple of different publications. Some have better spelling than others. So I have been spending time with those, but at the same time looking at the Namtar of Mingyur Peldron's brother, Rinchen Namgyel. He was 5 years older than her, and he also had a life story written about him. So I'm doing some comparative work in looking at, okay, what does this this important male figure, who was recognized at Mingyur as, he eventually became one of the central leaders of the institution as well. How does his Namtar look compared to hers? And doing some comparative work, looking at how her story is being constructed. And one thing that I found within her hagiography that's really interesting is that the author uses her gender to elevate her in ways that are unusual. Usually, at least in most forms, or many forms of Buddhist women's lives, their role as a woman is something that they have to overcome. It is something that stands in their way as an impediment to their path to enlightenment. In this story, it's actually something that helps her, instead. So it's interesting, and I see it as being related to her privilege.
Okay, so you write in the piece that female authority and privileged lives, that she was born, was raised in, and taught in Mingyur Monastery because her father and uncle founded the monastery. So I'm getting the impression that it's somewhat unexpected that she would also become a teacher in this monastery. Is that do I have that right?
Yeah, I mean, I perceive it as relatively unexpected. Mingyur is interesting in that there are a couple of hagiographies of women, and this is one of them. Mingyur Peldron's uncle wrote a hagiography of his mother, so her grandmother, a brief, very beautiful piece about her role in bringing up the family and sort of positioning her as this wonderful central figure in the institution. But you don't often see cases of women who are born into these families who rise to this prominence. So there's a handful of other women like this, but it's pretty unusual. And it's especially unusual to find a hagiography of this length written about one such woman.
Interesting. Well, and I'm also interested in the concept that you describe in the piece a lot about just the term privilege. And this is a term that has come to some significant prominence in our contemporary society the last, dozen years or so. Can you define a bit about what that term means within your work and why it frames your work on Mingyur Peldrön, who is not a person who is alive now, while the term privilege is changing throughout time?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So this is definitely a term that I'm imposing externally. It's a 21st century concept that I'm using to analyze her life. And I view it as a constellation of unearned advantages.
Mm.
So in any social context, those might include race, gender, status of wealth, education, but anything that is provided. And so one thing that makes Mingyur Peldrön unusual is that not only was she born into a life of privilege, and we have stories about other women who were born into such privileged lives. So Sarah Kondro, Kondro Tare Lamo, and others. But what makes Mingyur Peldrön a little bit different is that she accessed this privilege within her family, and she never left the family. She never had to escape expectations in order to pursue this religious life. In fact, it's almost as though the religious life, the life of a nun, was maybe imposed on her from within the family. So she had access to education that we don't see widespread evidence of women having access to this kind of religious training.
Mm. So it's like the luck of where she was born, almost. Like if she had been born in the town nearby, like there's almost no chance that she would have been selected for education and for leadership later on in her life.
Right. Yeah, we don't have much evidence of that. It's because she was born into the family that she was born into, because her father and uncle perceived her as someone who would be a good purveyor of the family's traditions in the next generation, and they saw fit to thus educate her.
Was it generous of her father and uncle to actually allow her to do this?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think so. There's a lot. So I have not explored the life of Terdok Lingpa as much as other folks have. So in conversations with other scholars like Dominique Townsend, my sense is that Terdok Lingpa had a rhetoric of inclusion
Mm.
that he put forth. It's unclear, though, how far that spread and whether or not that rhetoric of inclusion was actively used to educate other women beyond Mingyur Peldrön. So, and that's, I mean, I think that's a direction that we have to expand our knowledge about Minderling. But my sense is that, you know, it may have been generosity. It may have also been concern for the continuation of his institution.
I'm so glad I asked that question. I love that. Awesome. Um, so something that caught my eye is something that I've talked a little bit about on this show in the past, and that is the notion of wrathful deities. A friend of mine, Michael Van Hardingsveld, and I talked about wrathful deities in an episode on this show some time back. Um, but you write that she also received training in things like the magical display of the peaceful and wrathful deities. And I'm curious just a little bit, you don't have to say too much about this, but I'm curious how wrathful deities matter within Tibetan Buddhism and the life and times of Mingyur Peldron.
Yeah, so wrathful deities are fascinating. They're great, and they're definitely important in Tibetan Buddhism. And the great thing about wrathful deities is that they can be protectors of the Dharma, so protectors of the Buddhist teachings,
Mm.
even as they are fierce and terrifying. So they're wrathful for the good of the tradition, in a way that is it's fascinating, and it's cool. I love that there's a space for wrathful beings to be wrathful.
Yeah, I love like when I go into like a Zendo or something, and there's like a picture of Fudo Myo on the wall or something like that. It's so cool. I just love talking about that stuff.
Yeah, no, they're great.
So if anybody listening is familiar with Tibet or like the story of the Dalai Lama and exile, we know that this is something that seems to occur within Tibet. And Mingyur Peldrön is no exception to violence and exile. And you mentioned earlier that she was exiled. Can you tell me a little bit about the trauma that she faced in the year 1717?
Sure, absolutely. So, without going into too lengthy of a history,
Sure.
I'll just say, so in from 1717 to 1718, and then a few years after that, there was a civil war in central Tibet, and um, there were a lot of monasteries destroyed at this time, and Mindraling was one of them. And there's this very dramatic moment in Mingyur Peldron's hagiography where uh, basically her brother and her uncle are arrested. They're taken to Lhasa and they're executed. And she and another brother realize, okay, we have to get out of here. We have to escape. So she puts on a disguise, she sneaks out the back window, and she escapes. She leaves with a handful of attendants and goes to Sikkim. And in Sikkim, thanks to her privileged status as a member of the Mindraling family, she was welcomed as this great teacher, um, and she was basically, housed by the royal family. Her sister was married off to a member of the royal family during this time. That didn't work out so well, but okay. And she basically, that was when she started her teaching career, was in Sikkim. And once the fighting had died down, she was able to return and start to rebuild. And there's this really beautiful description of how she feels when she sees the monastery for the first time upon returning. She comes over this pass and sees it and sees that it's been destroyed, and she sings this beautiful song, basically calling out, in grief about this, what she's seeing. And she went on to help reconstruct the monastery. Her one of her other brother, Rinchen Namgyal, eventually returns as well from his exile, and together they rebuilt it.
Does that disaster almost like cement her leadership within the community?
I see it as cementing her leadership, definitely. And I see this post-war moment as providing the space for her to take on this prominent role in a way that she may not have. We'll never know, but it's possible she may not have if it hadn't been for this destruction, this loss of life, loss of leadership, and she was able to step into that gap.
So as she leads for the next, however many years, she has this emphasis, it seems like, on nuns. Can you tell me a little bit about her care for the women, for the nuns within her monastery?
Yeah, absolutely. She was very interested in nuns receiving strong education, and she spent a lot of time preaching to them, teaching them. She also taught monks. She also taught lay people. But her instructions to women were particularly interesting because she frequently advocated the monastic life for them, which I think is interesting, especially because of how she talks about it. There are points where she talks about, well, you might be worried that if you become a nun, you won't have the resources you need, but you should do it anyway.
Okay. So, we're alive now in 2020. We're talking about things that happened long ago, and I'm always seeking to find ways that things that happened long ago can inform us now. Why is studying the masters of Tibet across the centuries important for us living now in 2020? Like, what did the masters of Tibet have to teach us about life as we know it today?
Well, so I think that, they had a lot to teach us about life. And one thing is that we can get a great sense of context in understanding where we are today. So an example of this is that in the modern day, my sense is that a lot of people think about women studying Buddhism as a new phenomenon. This is the first time this has happened, and it's not. It may be the first time that women have had access to certain sets of teachings, and women have had access to extensive education, religious education on the scale that they have right now. But I think that looking at these early histories, especially of Buddhist women, can help us understand that some of the challenges that we face today are not new, and we can actually learn something from those who came before. I think it's important. It's always important to know history. I'm a historian first, I guess. In that, I think that there's a lot that if we forget our collective history, we're gonna be in trouble.
Well, something that I really enjoyed reading of yours was your biography of Mingyur Peldrön that you have on the Treasury of Lives website, which I think would be an excellent starting point for anybody interested in learning a bit more about this topic. You've disseminated such this big life down into this really digestible article with Treasury of Lives, which is so cool. If people want to find you, follow your work, see what you're up to, where can they find you if they want to know more?
So that's a good question. So I am on the Twitters, but
Yes.
I don't use it a lot, at least not right now. But they can find me also through email. Once I finish my book, that will come out and be available. But
Nice.
it's not yet, but sometime
Yeah.
soon. And so yeah, I think those are maybe the best ways.
Cool. Well, I will drop a link to your Twitter in the show notes. So if anybody's listening, they can just go into the show notes of this podcast episode and they can click the direct link from there and follow the work of Dr. Alison Melnick Dyer. Well, thank you so much for taking some time at the end of your semester to hang out with me and talk about the life of Mingyur Peldrön. This has been such a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Classical Ideas is produced by me, Greg Soden. Music on Classical Ideas is composed and performed by Derek Strybeck. You can find his music at www.wearewarmmusic.com. If you like this show, please rate it on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can email me at classicalideas@outlook.com or find me on Patreon at patreon.com/classicalideaspodcast. Thanks so much for listening.